Are employers desperate to hire nerds? You may have heard that there are terrible shortages of scientists, engineers, and especially computer programmers, software engineers, AI experts, all sorts of things related to computers and electronics. In this video, I'm going to talk about how true those claims are, what the implications are for looking for a job, whether you should even pursue a job in these fields. I'll give some of the history. I'll try to do it in an entertaining way. The upshot is that these statements and claims are at best greatly exaggerated and misleading, if not totally false. I have a video that I put out several years ago that's been getting a lot of views the last couple of weeks, so I thought I would update it for the new year. Are employers desperate to hire nerds? 2023. If you pay attention to the business press, to the general media, you'll often see articles like these. The U.S. needs more engineers. What's the solution? This is a report from just a few weeks ago from the Boston Consulting Group. That's BCG. It's a big management consulting firm. It's actually more balanced and nuanced than a lot of these articles. But again, the idea is there's a desperate need for engineers, and how do we fill them, with a particular emphasis on certain topics like education, immigration, so-called diversity. I'm going to talk about that. Another article here we have from the New York Times: America's semiconductor boom faces a challenge, not enough workers. Here we have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce addressing the STEM workforce shortage. These are nothing new. If you've paid attention to the news, you will see that articles like this are published every year, sometimes more in some years than others, but they are published year in and year out, even during recessions, even during periods of major downturns, when layoffs of engineers are in the news, when companies like Microsoft are laying people off very visibly, as, for example, happened several years ago when they laid off a huge number of people from their Nokia division and generally across the country at literally the same time that Bill Gates and Sheldon Adelson, the late Sheldon Adelson, and Warren Buffett published an op-ed, in their name anyway, urging for there to be more people in engineering, immigrants from other countries, even though they were laying people off at the same time. So what's the truth of these? If you get a degree in computer science and engineering at a good school, get good grades, are they going to fall down and worship you? Are they going to throw beautiful young women in short skirts at you? Any of this kind of stuff? How true is this? It's important for making your career decisions. Well, these claims are not new. They've actually been around for a very long time. And there are many well-documented examples of these claims in the 1950s, even before the Sputnik launch, which really jump-started all kinds of this kind of stuff. This is an article, for example, by Kenneth, a famous economist, and William Capron, both at Stanford at the time. And I'm just going to read a little bit about from the header, the opening paragraph of this article. This is from 1959, 2 years after Sputnik. The frequent and loud complaints of a shortage of engineers and scientists heard over the past 8 years, that's all the way back to 1951, or so, might be taken as indicating a failure of the price mechanism, and indeed have frequently been joined with, rather vaguely stated, proposals for interference with market determination of numbers and allocation. Now we'll get to that more in a little while. That often refers to pumping the pursuit of these careers through education, so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, training and promotion in schools, immigration policies, all kinds of things. I'll get to that more. But it's not at all new. These kind of claims were made in the 1950s, and they were grossly exaggerated, if not totally false at that time. Just to be clear, this is Kenneth Arrow. He passed away in 2017. And he was an American economist, mathematician, writer, and political theorist. Along with John Hicks, he won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1972. He's actually a very famous, prominent economist, as was William Capron. So these are not just some fringe character at a small college or something. These are guys from Stanford, very well known and respected. Remarkably, there are all sorts of complaints about shortages of technically knowledgeable and trained people after World War II and during the 1950s. And this is actually quite remarkable. Why is it remarkable? World War II was a high-tech war. This is the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the famous product of this massive wartime development program. It was B-29 bombers that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U.S. had very extensive aviation programs, very high-tech during the war. Of course, we had the Manhattan Project, which developed nuclear weapons, reactors, all that kind of technology. Recently covered in the Oppenheimer movie, for example. We had a giant program at MIT and other places to develop working radar technologies, a whole host of technologies, not just in aviation and rocketry and so forth were developed during the war, but many other fields, including chemotherapy for cancer, many, many different technologies. There were huge numbers of people working in these fields as technicians, as scientists, as engineers. Many physicists, for example, actually postponed getting their actual formal Ph.D. to go work on the Manhattan Project, all this kind of stuff. But somehow the businesses, the aviation companies, they couldn't find these people. After the war, they all were somehow very interested in new, unexperienced people from college because there was a shortage. Well, this environment, and especially Sputnik, led to a huge flood of people into certain fields. The fields that were emphasized at this time were not particularly computers and electronics like today, although those played a significant role. They were things like physics, aviation technology, rocketry, things related to the Cold War. And you can see the bubble that formed. Huge numbers of people went into physics, especially after Sputnik. You can see Sputnik is about here. And it soared up until about 1967, and there was a bubble bursting, just like the stock market crashing in 2008 or any of the bubbles that we're familiar with. Huge numbers of people who got PhDs in physics and many other technical fields driven by the Cold War couldn't find jobs. Some of them became taxi drivers. Some of them, as happens today, became programmers or something like that. But it was a big disappointment for a large number of people. And this is from an article by David Kaiser at MIT called American Physics in the Cold War Bubble. And I have a link to his web article. He was working on a book, although I don't think that it was ever actually published, on exactly this event. Now, this didn't stop with the bubble bursting in 1967. The sort of Cold War physics and other field bubble repeated in the 1980s. Under the Reagan administration, there was a big buildup. There were projects like the superconducting super collider and various others, many of which were canceled or scaled back after the Cold War ended. And it was a time when nerds were promoted in various movies like Revenge of the Nerds or Real Genius or Can't Buy Me Love, very glamorous, all those girls throwing themselves at these remarkably good-looking nerds in these movies, even in Revenge of the Nerds where they're actually a little bit geeky in appearance, but nerdiness was glamorized. And in fact, it is in the 80s that the term nerd was popularized as a reference to scientific technical people. It had been around for many years. It seems to have originated from a Dr. Seuss story, and it was popularized to some degree in the 1970s in the Happy Days show, where the Fonzie character, the cool, biker dude, would call various people a nerd. Now, he wasn't really referring to what we think of as nerds, technical people. It was just somebody who was like badly dressed or something like that, a square in 50s terminology. But in the 80s, particularly after the movie The Revenge of the Nerds came out, the term nerd took off, and it's largely referred to technical people. Okay, well, that's all well and good, but in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down. The U.S. and the Soviet Union tried to bury the hatchet, although we've kind of gone back to the Cold War now, but a lot happened, and all of a sudden, all of this stuff wasn't such a big deal. And a lot of people found themselves struggling to find work, far from the supposed shortages that they were told about in the 80s, just like those people in the 60s, 20 years before. This is the history of these claims, long before they became focused on computers and electronics as they are today, or AI, or various computer-related technologies. So what do we hear today? Well, today, these claims continue in physics, they continue in aviation, they continue in many fields which clearly don't have shortages, but by and large, they mostly tend to refer to computer technology more than anything else, to software engineers in particular, to programming. So I'm going to focus on those modern claims from now on in this presentation. So there's three themes that occur over and over in these, shortage claims and all this kind of stuff, and for the last probably 30 or 40 years. One is education, and this goes way back to the 50s. This is the documentary Waiting for Superman from 2010. And the premise here is we have just horrible education. These companies can't find Americans to do the jobs because the schools are so bad, particularly public schools. And we need reform of the educational system, which seems to mean some funny things, but this is one of the themes. No matter, and these businesses have been, quote, reforming the educational system for over 30 years. Bill Gates, for example, with Common Core and all this kind of stuff. They have enormous influence. Billions and billions of dollars has been put into improving the educational system in the United States, allegedly. Now, invariably in these accounts, they say the education system is absolutely horrible, this wreck like in this movie or documentary slide here. They say that even though the percentage of Americans who take and pass the A, B, and BC advanced placement calculus exams has actually increased at a steady rate of something like 6 or 7% every year since the 1970s. It's several hundred thousand people who take and pass, get the 3 out of 5 or better grade on the AB and the advanced BC calculus advanced placement tests. So there's lots of evidence that this focus on science and technology really is producing a large increase in the number of supposedly qualified people. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit more in a couple of slides. So there's education. It's always bad. It's terrible. It's getting worse. We need to do all sorts of things despite the billions of dollars spent on reforming education. And the second thing is what's now called diversity. One also hears the term underrepresented minorities. So the idea here is that, well, we want certain people, they use these kind of euphemisms like underrepresented minorities. And if only we could sort of improve the educational system and bring them into this high-tech jobs, wouldn't that be wonderful? And it would solve our shortage, sort of, supposedly. And it would also just be a good thing, right? It would be wonderful. And these usually discuss the work environment, the makeup of the scientific and engineering workforce in the United States, as if they're all white men, with buzz cuts and so forth, kind of like a shot of Mission Control at NASA in 1969, where they're all sitting there watching the Apollo land on the moon, that kind of thing. That's the way this is framed. And of course, they're really interested in bringing people from underrepresented minorities, which means, in fact, appears to mean basically African Americans and Hispanics, and really they're talking about Hispanics who have a lot of visible American Indian ancestry. And now these are the two groups which you almost never find in these high-tech fields. I show a couple of high-profile examples here. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who has a Ph.D. in physics. That's very unusual for an African American or anyone who's black to get a Ph.D. in physics. That's what my degree is in, so I'm speaking from both personal experience as well as looking at the numbers. And he's one of the most high-profile African American technical people. Another person is up until recently, the president of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, also a Ph.D. in physics, Shirley Ann Jackson. Okay, but this has almost nothing to do with the actual makeup of these fields, and it has nothing to do with the actual makeup, for the most part, of the people that are being recruited into these fields as by these companies, even though they talk about diversity. It looks a lot like bait and switch, right? Oh, we're doing this for the poor and the oppressed and all that, but actually, here's what they want. The third arm of these is, well, we know the schools are so bad, And if the schools weren't so bad, then we could hire all of these American-born black people and Hispanic people, and we'd love to do that. But the trouble is the schools are really, really bad, and that we have nothing to do with that, even though we cooked up Common Core or these other things. It's always these teachers' unions or just some random, somebody out there other than us is responsible, despite the billions we've lobbied to have invested in education, and despite, of course, things like the Common Core, which is a Bill Gates production. So, what we need are rich people or upper middle class people from India, from China, from South Africa. They can run our companies, they can do the work. So, that's what we need. We need immigrants from certain groups and not others. Most of those immigrants are from places like India or China or Eastern Europe, and there's a few random people from Africa, like Elon Musk, for example, is a native South African originally. And that's who they really want to bring in, and that's who's largely being brought in. But again, they talk about it in this funny way about diversity, which seems to suggest that they want to import large numbers of poverty-stricken people from, maybe Sudan or someplace. And they're okay with some people from there, like the very well-off people. But that's basically what they say. That's the modern thing. And this is almost all about computers and electronics with a little bit of other stuff thrown in. It's not so much about physics and rocketry anymore. Well, what's the reality? What's really going on? Now, you'll hear all these companies talk about how difficult it is to find qualified workers. And they usually immediately jump from complaining about how they just can't find people who know what they're doing to discussing K through 12 education, often sort of like 12-year-olds. It's like, well, if only those terrible schools in Washington, D.C. or Newark, New Jersey or, maybe Eastern Tennessee or someplace like that, right? Poor people. If only those schools were better, we would get these people who've learned, high school algebra and that kind of thing. Those people, that's really the skills that are missing here, right? The problem that we have here is we can't find people who can do high school algebra or maybe calculus, right? Never mind about all those people that are taking and passing the BC calculus and the AB calculus, but that's not the issue here. Even though there are all those people, and we don't seem to hire a lot of them, we're really concerned about the people who don't take AP calculus and can't seem to get through algebra. So that's the line. It has nothing to do with what they will tell you when you're actually qualified, you're trying to get a job, and you find that they're not really that interested in people who have those qualifications, right? They aren't. Well, they talk about two things, what I call purple squirrels and mutant supermen. So first let me define a purple squirrel. This is from Wikipedia. This term was more popular a few years ago. But purple squirrel is a term used by employment recruiters to describe a job applicant with precisely the right education, set of experience, and range of qualifications that perfectly fits the job's requirements. The implication is that over-specification of the requirements makes a perfect candidate as hard to find as a purple squirrel. In technology fields, it's very common to find very narrow and extensive, quote, requirements, ostensibly for hiring people. So this is often like a programming language. You have to have at least 3 years of paid professional. It can't be like at a nonprofit organization or working for the government or stuff you do in school, like at a college or something like that. It's got to be paid professional experience in the latest version usually of this language. It would be Python 3.11, for example. Python 2 definitely isn't going to work because that's old. Even Python 3.10, even though it's almost the same thing as Python 3.11, again, you got to have 3 years of experience with Python 3.11, even though it probably didn't come out 3 years ago. And it's not just one of these things, but dozens of them. Now, having lots of experience with programming isn't enough. It has to be the right programming language, the right tools. If you know a different tool, it's not unlike as if you've been driving for 20 years, right? You got your driver's license when you were 18 or something, and you were 38 or something, and you've driven for 20 years, and according to all official things, you're a better driver, and you're less likely to be in a fatal car accident than somebody 20 years younger. But you're driving a Volvo, right? Or you're driving a Ford, this, and well, they want you to drive a Tesla, for example, or even just some other brand, a Toyota, right? You haven't been driving a Toyota for 20 years. In fact, 3 years of paid professional experience driving a Toyota is not transferable to driving, a Mercedes or whatever, right? So this is the the supposed way that they're hiring people. This is how they can say they can't find people who are qualified or a special experience, how they turn down and even ignore, don't even bother to interview people with very impressive credentials, but, well, it's not in this specific skill, or let alone a whole bunch of them. They're not the purple squirrel. That's at least what they say, and that's a very common excuse. It has nothing to do with whether you did really well in high school algebra or you had BC calculus and got a 5 out of 5 on the BC calculus exam. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you went to Carnegie Mellon and did 4 years of getting straight A's in computer programming at Carnegie Mellon. Okay, it's none of that. It's you got to have this paid professional experience in very specific tools. It can't be just like work, or I should say homework problems and projects that you did in school. So that's the purple squirrels. Overlapping with this, but really conceptually different, is the so-called 10x developers, the 10x engineers, 10x scientists, even 100x you hear some. These are mutant supermen. These are people who can outperform not just a little bit, say, your typical MIT graduate or your typical Carnegie Mellon graduate or somebody who went to Oxford or anything like that, right? These are supermen. These are Einstein, supposedly, right? These are people who are 10 or even 100 times better than anybody else, or than the vast majority of people, even with a lot of experience and training and so forth. It's never quite explained where these people come from or how they can be 10 times better, or why it's difficult to identify them, since you would think they'd be pretty obvious, right? And you would think they would get paid 10 times as much as, the other programmers, right? But that doesn't usually seem to happen. And I'll say a little bit more about that when I get to why I think these things happen. Is this actually what they're doing? Now, these are the excuses that they give. Now, I don't claim that there isn't an interest in specific expertise. It definitely helps you get a job to actually have expertise in something that's hot, like Python maybe, or Python 3.11, like in my example. Nonetheless, is this really what they're doing? Many of these companies, Google is actually probably a pretty good example, hire huge numbers of people right out of school who don't have these types of experience. What experience they have is clearly just school experience, and yet people have more experience, such as myself, for example, who show up and say, well, I've been doing this for years, but you don't have that specific experience. You don't have Python 3.11. You got to have Python 3.11 and similar kinds of things. This has been going on as far back as I know, to the early 90s, probably much earlier. If you do your engineering with a red pencil and we do it with a blue pencil, we can't hire you. That's the supposed excuse. Now, is it really what they do? As I said, many of these companies hire people who clearly don't have these qualifications that they claim are so important when they're turning a lot of people down, or when they're trying to explain to somebody like newspaper reporters or politicians or other people who start asking about this. It's like, well, I know this guy who's got 20 years of experience. Why aren't you hiring him, right? This isn't abstract. I mean, President Obama, this is a while ago now, got asked this by the wife of a guy who was laid off by Texas Instruments. Why couldn't he find another job? Okay, so this is the context in which this happens. These are the excuses that are used. There may even be a little bit of truth to them, but nonetheless, it doesn't really match up with what they do. What do they do? Well, they seem to like to hire people with no real experience, like right out of school, or a few years of experience, and then they seem to get rid of those people, right? So you turn 30, and the clock is ticking. Maybe they don't get rid of you at 30, but it's well known in the computer industry that it's not good to be over 35. It's especially not good to look or act over 35. It's like the old movie and book Logan's Run. This is a movie from the 70s when I was a kid. And the gotcha in this is that they have this sort of utopian society in the future, except something happens to everybody when they're 30. It turns out they're all murdered when they turn 30. It was originally a book. The book, it was actually at 20, but they amped up the age of the people to 30 in the movie. It was actually made into a TV show where they added another element besides this computer running this, dystopia. And that is that there's this little inside group of these older guys with gray hair who don't get liquidated at 30 who really run everything. Which is kind of like Hollywood, I think. This is kind of the Hollywood system, right? You have all the young people out in front, but there's these older folks who really run the show in the background who don't show up very often when the camera is turning. They're behind the camera. In any case, the computer industry looks a lot like this. They bring in a lot of young people, get them very excited. We have a terrible shortage. You work hard. You don't have to work that hard. We pay well. But then people start to have problems. Very similar way in academia. Actually, I'd say it's worse in academia. It's the Logan's Run economy. The obvious question is why all of this is done, right? Why wouldn't a company um, sort of invest in its employees? Why wouldn't they want employees who are over 30, who have lots of experience, who make fewer mistakes, who've seen it all before, or a lot of it before? I can't say they've seen it all because there is genuine technological pro. What are they going for here? What's the motivation behind what they actually do? I don't know for sure. I can't read people's minds. I can't be absolutely sure. It's probably true that some people genuinely believe some of these ideas, that they need the purple squirrels they can never find, they need the mutant supermen they can rarely, if ever, find. Some people probably believe it, but I don't think that's the situation with most of them. How can you explain companies that say this and then hire large numbers of people right out of school who are hardworking? I'm not going to complain that they're not, but they're not these mutant supermen. They're not these purple squirrels. What is it that they're doing? And so I'm going to present my theory as to what they're really doing. They are worried that the experienced employees, and I'm saying experienced, not old, these people are being pushed out at 30, 35, never mind older people. Age discrimination we often think of as something that happens to you in your 50s or 40s at the earliest. But this is happening to people at a very young age. Now, some of it may be that they really value the ability to work long hours. You don't have kids, you're really healthy in your 20s. That's probably part of it. But I think that's not the real reason for most of this. They're afraid of losing control. They're afraid that they will lose control to more experienced people, and they don't want that. They want young, healthy, hardworking, compliant, excited workers who are not much of a threat to the people who really run things, like the older guys in the Logan's Run TV show from the 70s. That's what they're doing. And so this is a science fiction example of this. This is Frank Herbert's Dune. This is the miniseries the Sci-Fi Channel did in 2000 with the late William Hurt, who's the guy standing up here. He's playing Duke Leto. And Duke Leto is a really great Duke, and he's in charge of getting the spice production. It's sort of a parody of the Middle East, right? The whole transportation system of this empire depends on this mind-altering sort of glorified LSD that gives people psychic powers and makes you live longer and does all kinds of miraculous things. It's a very 1960s story. It's a very famous book from the 1960s if you don't know it. And it's been remade as a not-so-good movie. Better special effects, better props, things like that. But I think the miniseries does a better job of telling the story. A key part of the story is that Duke Leto does too good a job. He threatens the Emperor. The Emperor's afraid he's going to get kicked out in favor of Duke Leto. So he has him killed, and the whole family. He tries to wipe them all out, right? So the point is that although they say they want the very best, they want these 10x programmers, they want these super specialists, etc., those people are a potential threat. Much better to have younger people who don't know too much, who are very motivated, are hopefully a bit naive about this kind of power politics stuff. They haven't paid close attention to Dune, for example, although many of them have probably read it. But that, I think, is what drives a lot of this. You have an elite of, quote, founders and venture capitalists and other people who are often older. Some of them are younger, but they're often older. Probably many of them are from fairly wealthy, politically and sort of financially connected families, just like the ruling families in Dune or in the Holy Roman Empire or the Renaissance in Italy that Dune is patterned on. And they're afraid of losing control. Not without some reason, but they're afraid of losing control. So they would get rid of people before they learn enough, hopefully before they learn enough to be a threat. But in any case, get rid of them before they become or can potentially become a threat to your control over what's going on, and maintain this very young, workforce, kind of like especially the television version of Logan's Run, where they have this inner group that runs things. So, in conclusion, Employers are not desperate for nerds. And although they want smart, hardworking, compliant workers, they actually aren't that interested in supermen and the very best. Now, it doesn't mean they don't sometimes hire them. It doesn't mean that sometimes those people don't become part of that ruling elite. It doesn't mean that those people aren't needed sometimes. But the general philosophy is to make up in quantity what you don't have in quality. And I'm not saying that the people that are hired or work very hard for these companies. You know, Google employees are mostly, or Apple employees. I worked at Apple for a little while. These are hardworking people. These are smart people. These are motivated people. They're doing a good job. But they're selected as very young, of limited knowledge, and they are gotten rid of in many cases because they might become a threat and replaced with other younger people, just like in various other systems or associates at corporate law firms or other places which do something similar. They bring people in, but they're really at most interested in only a few of those people who are going to toe the party line or are seen as not that threatening and so on. So employers are not desperate for nerds. And in fact, they often are pursuing this policy, it appears, of getting rid of you as you get older. Even sometimes you hear about this happening to people in their late 20s. They don't even hit 30, let alone 35, where it becomes more and more common. That's also why people go off and be consultants or try to found their own business or stuff like that, because these companies are not stable long-term employers at all. They don't like to have these highly experienced people who pose a potential threat to them. And it's really the experience and the skill that's the threat. It's not because you're 50 or age discrimination. Yes, that's probably a factor too, but the reason they're getting rid of people so young is because they're worried about people who even have, say, 10 years of experience. That might be a threat in some cases. So employers are not desperate for nerds. And that was true in the 1950s, if not earlier. It's been true ever since. Employers are not desperate for nerds. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.